You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends, LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us. Our guest is someone I'd always wanted to have on the podcast. He told me a year or two that he was starting to write a book, and he very graciously sent me one. Our guest is Ed Simcox. The book is In the Room, a memoir. And, when you're dealing with someone like Ed Simcox, who literally is loved by everyone and has done so many things, you need some backup. So, dressed like he just came off the set of Magnum P.I., is Jim Shella. Nice to see you, Jim. It's been a while.
Good afternoon. Nice to see you. Nice to see you, Ed.
Good to see you,
You've known
Jim.
Ed about 40 years, so why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I came to town in 1982, and Ed had been Secretary of State for 4 years at that point.
That's right.
And I got to tell you, the brightest memory I have about your tenure as Secretary of State is the Indy 500 party you would throw every year.
I think about that often, and people from time to time mention it to me. We had, Robert, we had a big tent out at the Country Club of Indianapolis where we could bring 500 people together, and we invited the drivers and car owners. It was a week before the race. Actually, Larry Conrad started it when Larry Conrad was Secretary of State, and one of the things he told me to do, really emphasized it. He said, you got to take this and keep it going as a tradition, which I did. It was great fun, and got to meet all these guys. In fact, I was looking through pictures when I was doing the book, and 3 of the 4 men who won 4 races, I've got a picture with them from that. They would come out to that.
Well, and obviously you invited the State House press corps to be there as well.
Yeah, that's right.
It was a great opportunity for us, and it went away shortly after you left office, correct?
It did, yes. And I urged, Evan Bayh succeeded me, and I urged Evan in the handoff, the transition between the two of us. I said, you ought to consider keeping this going, and he didn't. He had other things in his mind, and so it dropped at that point.
Yeah. You mentioned following Larry Conrad in office. He was a Democrat. You're a Republican. Larry went on to run for governor unsuccessfully, but he became kind of a transcendent figure in this community. Was it tough to fill his footsteps?
Well, we became friends. In fact, his daughter, Amy Conrad, worked for me when I was in the office. She became of age where she needed a job, and Larry called me, and I said, absolutely. And so I got to know Amy.
It's Amy Conrad,
you mentioned,
right?
Right.
You mentioned him running for governor. Here's a guy, and he's the only guy I know from my political groupie history that I think about from time to time, who ran 4 statewide races in 8 years. He ran for Secretary of State, then he ran for governor. He was defeated in the primary, and then he ran for Secretary of State again 2 years later, and then 2 years after that, he ran for governor again. Having run statewide once every 4 years, I cannot imagine doing this. I mean, it was it was literally 8 years of travel and campaigning for him. But he did it, and two of those races were successful, the 2 Secretary of State races. The 2 gubernatorial races were not. But he was quite a guy, as you know, and great storyteller. And we would sit, and in fact, we, from time to time, would get other people in the group just to tell stories. But Larry and I got along famously.
Tell me about the Secretary of State's office, because it's often the subject of jokes at the State House. People say that it's the job of the Secretary of State to guard the state's seal.
Yeah.
You found it to be more significant than that, I'm sure.
I did. In the book, I tell a little bit about holding the office and some of the things we did. When you read books written by people who have held offices, Ted Sendak was going way back, was Attorney General, wrote a book, and various other people. They tend to want to bore you with all the statistics about the things they did when they were in office, and books written about people who held office are filled with that stuff. And I was determined not to do that. I wanted to tell stories that would be of interest to the reader. I hope I did. But I did devote, with some apology, I told to the reader, I said, I'm not going to fill this with statistics, but I got a few things I'm proud of doing. And so what we did in there, Jim, and you may remember this, the office is very technical. It's, our constituency are not people, guy off the street. The constituency largely are lawyers, because we regulated
business people, right?
Lawyers and business people. We regulated the securities industry. We dealt with lawyers all over the state. I got to know lawyers in every county. We regulated corporations and corporate filings. That's a legal practice kind of a thing. The Uniform Commercial Code, which is highly complicated and technical in nature. And again, the guy on the street doesn't understand a lot about that. But anyway, we essentially did legal functions. I had a lot of lawyers working for me in there.
And you oversee elections.
Pardon me?
And you oversee elections.
And not the least of which, I might add, was a huge function for the office, was the degree to which we had election functions there, and actually more than is the case now. I was involved in recounts. Now we have a state recount commission. I was involved with a number of other things that went to other agencies. We regulated lobbyists and lobbyist filings, and that is, of course, done now by the Lobby Commission. So we did a lot of things that have peeled off into other offices. It's a ministerial office. It's not an office that makes policy. That's why people don't understand it, don't know much about it.
And it's not involved in foreign diplomacy.
No. No, it's not.
It's not what I've heard recently.
Yeah. So you served 2 terms. I did a little research this morning, and you didn't have an opponent in either election.
Well, I had not in the Republican primary. I had, of course, Democrat opponents, Rex Carpenter on the first one, and Steve Beardsley in '82 in my reelection effort. But I had served as secretary of the state Republican Party for 5.5 years. I knew all the county chairs. I'd worked with them all over the state. And I had become kind of an expert on, if I might say, on election laws. And they called me when I was at the Republican State Committee if they had issues at the polling places, recount issues, all these kinds of things that come up on elections. And so I was their go-to person, so I got to know them all. When I ran in the convention in '78, I did not have opposition because I really had a lot of people already sealed up and committed to me, going in it.
You never sought elected office beyond that. Why not?
I didn't. It is not to say that I didn't want to. Gordon Darnell was my campaign manager in both of those races, and he used to laugh and say Simcox is the only guy that wanted to hold the Secretary of State's office just for the sake of holding that office. Everybody else used it as a stepping stone. Ed Whitcomb was secretary.
We should note that Mr. Darnell is a proud Manual Redskin.
There you go. Yes, he is.
We like to highlight the IPS kids here on the podcast.
Well, it was that things didn't fall in place for me. In those days, every office, it's that way today, every office in the State House was held by a Republican. And so I was on a ring of the ladder, but I couldn't go up. And it's not that I didn't want to and didn't think a lot about it. Almost made a run when John Mutz when John Muntz ran again, met Evan Bayh. That was the year that I left office. It was 2 years after I left office. And that was the one that got away. And the one that really got away from me was when Quayle won on the national ticket and had to resign as both a U.S. Senator, but also a candidate for re-election to the Senate. Governor Orr, under Indiana law, appointed someone to fill that vacancy. That's the one I really wanted. And I went for it. There were about 5 of us who competed for that.
And I think history will show that the governor offered it to Mitch Daniels, and he declined, and then he offered it to Dan Coates.
Exactly. And I put that in the book. I said, after Daniels determined that he was, if you remember, he had left the White House by then. He brought his family back to Indiana.
The Reagan White House, the first time he was in the White House.
Exactly. And he had really transferred everything back here and wanted to raise his family here and not in Washington, D.C. And so he declined it. Well, at that point, it opened up, and Steve Goldsmith and Pat Kiley and Bill Hudnut and I were kind of the principal people that we interviewed with the governor. I filled out, they did due diligence on all of us. I filled out a very elaborate and lengthy questionnaire. And when the governor called me, he said, because I was pretty close to Bob Orr, I've worked very closely with him. I was almost a part of his administration, though I was a separately elected official. I felt like I was part of his cabinet. I was in on a lot of meetings with him and traveled all over with him for 8 years. And when he called me, he said, this is going to be the toughest call I've got to make. So I braced because I knew, okay, I'm going to hear the bad news. And he told me that he had gone to Dan Coates. And as I think back on it, Coates succeeded Quayle in Quayle's congressional seat. Quayle was in Congress. Then he succeeded him in the congressional seat. He was from Fort Wayne. Dan was from that area, Huntington, of course. And I suspect that Dan Quayle, probably the new vice presidential candidate, probably called his governor and friend Bob Orr and said, look, I'm interested in Coates doing this. I would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
So I didn't, and I called Coates when I hung up from the governor. And my next phone call was to Dan Coates, and I said, I got to tell you, I was praying that I would get this, but if I didn't, I prayed that it would go to you. And he said to me, he laughed and he said, I was doing the same thing for you, which was very nice. But he was a model public servant in my mind, Dan Coates. And so it was a tough one for me because I knew that at that point I was probably out of politics. And I really wanted that. But I would say to lose it to a guy like Dan Coates was okay.
You mentioned prayer. I mean, we all pray, and politicians mention it a lot, but you really were, even in terms of politicians, you were evangelical before evangelical was cool.
Yes, I was. In fact, there was an analysis in either the Fort Wayne paper or the Star when, we were talking about filling the Quayle vacancy, and they assessed each of the candidates and what they might have going for them. And in my name, they said, Simcox, this is a paraphrase, Simcox will have a strong following in the conservative evangelical movement. I think they were probably right because I chaired the governor's prayer breakfast for 20 years. I was on the advisory committee for it, got a lot of speakers to come in for it. I was involved in prison fellowship I'm still involved in prison fellowship. I've been involved in prison fellowship and prison ministry for 40 years. I've been in prisons all over the country doing that. And chaired a Billy Graham crusade here in 1999, which was I worked harder on that probably than anything else, any other project I'd ever done. I worked on it for a year. Got to know Dr. Graham when he was in town for the week of the crusade, spent personal time with him. He was a student of politics. He wanted to talk about politics more than anything else. And the next year was the Bush-Gore famous 2000 race, of course. So he wanted to talk about that because he knew both men very well. And he had his preference in that race, but he was all through the years, he was very careful not to get to. There's a book written about him called The Pastor to the Presidents. It tells about all these relations he had going back to Truman. Very close to Lyndon Johnson. He and Johnson were very close. He was very close to H.W. Bush. Those were the two guys that really locked in with him and so forth. So anyway, I had a fascinating time with him, one-on-one conversations, where he would talk about world leaders and politics and all this kind of stuff, in addition to the 4 nights of the crusade, which was a wonderful experience.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today, former Secretary of State, Ed Simcox. We're discussing his new book, which is a fascinating trip down Hoosier politics, memory lane, but not just that, other things as well. His book is called In the Room, a Memoir. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, you left elected politics, but you've never been very far away from it. I mean, you've been at state conventions, at state dinners. I mean, you've maintained a high profile in the Indiana Republican Party all this time in ways that others don't. Why is that?
Jim, there were a couple of points when I decided that when I was going to back away from politics. And I was kind of drawn back into it, one of which was when Pence ran for governor. I really was moving away from it. He pulled me back in. He wanted me to be on his campaign executive committee, and then he wanted me to meet with him very frequently when he was in the office, and we worked on a number of things together. I was in a Bible study with him every week at the residence during his governorship. And I chaired 20 Republican state conventions. It's got to be a record.
Yeah.
I attended 30 of them, 31.
How do you get that duty?
State chairman. The state chairman asks you to do it.
And you do a good job, and so you get asked again, right?
Number of state chairs. I worked with a number of them.
You didn't say the pay.
It doesn't pay very much. In fact, it doesn't pay anything.
Ask him, Jim. Put him on the spot. Ask him who his favorite Republican state chairman was.
Well, yeah. Who was your favorite Republican state chairman? You mentioned Gordon Darnell, but
I knew so many of them.
Were you to tell me this? You're talking about state chairman and state conventions.
Yeah.
You were the chair of the state convention.
Yeah.
When Steve Goldsmith was the Republican nominee for governor.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, I'm picking the wrong year. I want to go to when Lindley Pearson was the Republican nominee for governor.
Right. Yeah, 94.
There was a big fight over his running mate.
That's right.
And Lindley Pearson left the convention and went back to his campaign office.
Yes.
And threatened not to return. And you were one of the people who went and convinced him to come back, correct?
I was. It was.
What was the It was 92, so buys reelect.
It was 92, yes. 92.
And what was why was he so angry?
It was because, if I may, there was controversy about lieutenant governor's race, but the real controversy was over the attorney general's race. Tim Bookwalter was the nominee. He was a prosecuting attorney at that time in a county twice removed from here. David Miller, who was Len Pearson's chief deputy when Len Pearson served as attorney general, was.
Your day moves fast. Your news should too. That's why there's a new and improved Wish TV app, bringing you more local news, breaking alerts, live streaming, weather forecasts, radar, and Indiana sports, all in one place. Customize your news feed to see the stories that matter most to you and get the information you need when you need it. Download the new and improved Wish TV app today on iOS or Android and take News 8 with you everywhere.
Also a candidate. Pearson had issues with the way the delegates selected Bookwalter over Miller. He and Diane, his wife, and remember that he had been, of course, nominated in the May primary, so this is June, so he was the nominee, the guy at the convention who was going to lead the party. he didn't like the result. He walked off the stage, and Rex Early was state chair. And
Our boy.
I was parliamentarian of that convention. I was not. I didn't chair it. I was parliamentarian.
Okay, but as I recall, the delegation that went to retrieve him was Marge O'Loughlin, Rex Early, and you.
Me. He goes to his headquarters, which was 101 on Ohio Street,
West Ohio. Yeah.
So Rex gets me, and the proceedings are going on, and he grabs me and Marge O and says, "We got to go get him. He's got to get back here before this thing adjourns, because always the last thing you do, the candidates all hold their hands up,
the big
and
photo.
That's the photo picture for the next day's newspapers and so forth. So we go over there, and we're trying to talk him into it, and he's very obstinate about it. He doesn't want to go back. He said, "I'm not going to campaign with this guy. I'm not going to participate with this guy." And finally, I turned to Diane, his wife, and I said, we argued with him for 15 minutes, and we're looking at the clock because the proceedings are going on without us. I'm parliamentarian, state chairman is over here. And I turned to Diane and I said, "Diane, if you want to leave this convention and start on the right foot to be the next governor, your husband, you've got to go back. He has to go back." She looks at Lynn and says, "Lynn, he's right. Let's go." She grabs her purse and gets up. End of argument. So I ultimately talked to the right person, of course.
Honest to goodness.
And you were covering that. I was driving the car for Ann DeVore.
Okay.
Well, that was part of the controversy too.
Keep going.
Yeah. There's a story. There's a story about Ann and sitting on the podium, and she and Rex were oil and water at that point, because she, as you well know, more than most, had designs on, she contemplated a lieutenant governor's race.
I got to hear all about it in a drive to near Chicago, and I gave up the Michigan Notre Dame game that day. I can tell you it was a Saturday, and she had me convinced she was going to be lieutenant governor.
Yep.
And she had me convinced that Lindley Pearson was going to be the best candidate for governor, and Evan Bayh was in a lot of trouble. And how many percentage points did Evan Bayh win in his reelect?
It wasn't close.
It wasn't close. I can tell you, Lindley Pearson invited me into his office, without the camera. He wanted a private meeting with me one day so that he could tell me that he was the only guy who could beat Evan Bayh, and he had the right plan. And I pressed him, "What's the plan?" And he wouldn't share it. And of course, he never came up with a decent plan.
Ultimately, he never did have what we would classify as a plan, in my view. But there's an unrepeatable incident that happened on the podium with Ann and Rex on one side of me. She's sitting on the other side of me, which
you could tell us,
which I'll have to tell you after the podcast.
I've heard it from Rex, and I don't remember it at the moment. But yeah, I mean, speaking, your book jacket says that you mentioned unforgettable characters. I got to believe Rex is near the top of that list.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
What made Rex? When Rex passed, we did a podcast. It was Jim, Murray, and me. And the Star let me write sort of a kind of a tribute to him. The Indianapolis Star did. Before we get back to your book, what makes someone like Rex? Because, he's unique, but there's a lot of unique people like Rex in politics.
That's right. More so in the old days.
Correct.
People are a little more buttoned down today.
Yeah. What made him so? This is a question for both of you. What made Rex so endearing?
Rex was crazy like a fox. He would present as this good old boy from Vincennes, but he was sharp as a tack. Yeah. And anybody who bought into that routine and got fooled by it got taken in some way, I think.
When he became state chair, he introduced a different kind of a crowd than Republican dinners are typically seeing.
Bakers
he
from
had
Southern
guys
Indiana with lots of jewelry.
well, and he had bikers.
Right.
These guys had the leather vests going on, They'd come because when he'd raise money, he'd say to these guys, "Look, I need your money for the party." And he didn't take a salary. He did not take a salary. I don't know if other state chairs didn't. My guess is he might be the only one.
I think he was the only
one. My
one.
memory.
Kittle took a salary?
Maybe Kittle might be the only
Kittle
other
might
one
be
that
a
didn't.
Kittle.
I know he got a car because I bought it from him.
Yeah.
Well, but anyway, Rex introduced a lot of people to politics that were not theretofore involved in politics. Let's put it that way.
We've been lucky enough to have Steve Goldsmith sit in that very seat. It took Jim 8 seconds to ask him about various rivalries and feuds. And Mayor Goldsmith was phenomenal. He was a terrific guest, really.
I agree.
And all three of us were surprised that it went so well. 1996, who did you support and why?
I supported Steve, and it might not have been different had what I'm going to tell you not occurred this way, but if you remember, Rex got in very late, and Steve was moving around a year and a half to 2 years before, talking to everybody that he knew and seeking commitments. And so I talked to him literally 18 months before that race, and I said, yes, I'll support you. So Rex comes along substantially later, and he actually, quite honestly, Rex never forgave me fully for not supporting him in that race. As close as we were in other ways and the things we did together.
We should rename the podcast to Rex Never Forgave Me.
He was good at holding a grudge.
He was. But there are a lot of stories associated with that race too, which is going down memory lane.
Was that the first time you got involved in politics? Late 60s, early 70s? If I get my timeline correct?
Late 60s.
So in the last 60 years, because you graduated from high school in 67 or college?
College.
Okay.
I graduated high school in 63, and I was involved in 63 in politics. I've been involved over 60 years.
So 67, so you graduated about 6 months before I was born from college.
Okay.
And that's the only reason I bring that up as a frame of reference, because in doing some reading, not only for this podcast and for others, and Jim, we've brought this up before, was 96 that Republican primary between Goldsmith and Early the most vicious sort of intra-party fight you've ever seen? If not, what was?
It was not the most. The one that was in my memory was the first one I was involved in, which was 1968. Otis Bowen was a candidate for governor against Ed Whitcomb. And the Whitcomb and Bowen factions of the party were very far apart in those days. Actually, later I got to know Otis Bowen well and befriended him, and I read a chapter on each of these. I read a chapter on each of 8 governors that I worked with in the book. But my dad was a county Republican chairman in LaPorte County at that time, and most of the county chairs up in northern Indiana were Bowen people. Whitcomb kind of had southern Indiana. Bowen had the north part of the state.
Whitcomb being from Seymour and Bowen being from Bremen.
Yes, exactly. And so we were a county, one county removed from Marshall County, his home county, but Dad was a Whitcomb guy. And so that's how I came to drive Whitcomb in his 68 campaign for governor after he was nominated. I really cut my teeth in politics doing that more than anything else. But
there's a long list of people who cut their teeth in politics, driving people around.
Being a driver.
John Hammond, Paul Manweiler.
Here's one.
Marty Obst.
Yeah.
I want to tell you one of the interesting things about Jim Houston too. Was a driver, and for Marge O.
Didn't Grand? Please tell me Bob Grand drove somebody.
Bob Grand drove Bob Orr.
Right.
when Bob Orr ran for governor. Bob Grand drove Bob Orr. Yes, indeed. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I just want to see him behind the wheel, being told what to do, because we love him. I think Bob Grant is one of the best.
Where were we?
The worst race, the most vicious.
It was very hard fought, and
that was in the days before negative TV advertising, though. Right?
Yeah, it was.
So you're saying it was hard fought behind the scenes.
It was. You used the term intra-party.
Yeah,
it was very much a party affair. It wasn't one of these things where they were hammering each other on paid media and so forth, and the public's reading it. Essentially, it was a county chair, individual delegate kind of a fight, and it was close. And Doc, it was a frame of reference for him throughout the rest of his career. He never quite got over that 68 race, as was maybe the case with Rex. One could say it left him with a scar.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Ed Simcox, author of In the Room, a memoir. We're joined by Jim Shella. They've known each other for decades. Ed, I'm going to ask you probably the hardest question anyone's ever asked you. Is there a particular Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most?
I admire several for several different reasons, Bob. Ed Whitkin gave me my first job, and so we always remember the guy that gave us our start in politics and gave us our first job, and it was Whitcomb for me. And I got to know him very well. I knew him better when I was more of an adult. In those days, I was driving him, carrying his briefcase, picking up his laundry, gassing the car. I was a kid. He was the candidate for governor. Later, I got to know him man to man, and we became very close. And so I have a special place in my heart for him. My hero and my mentor is not from Indiana. It's Charles Colson, who served in the Nixon White House as special counsel to the president, did a 7-month term in a federal prison, got out and formed a prison ministry. And I joined him in that prison ministry. I went on his board of directors, and I was on it for 30 years. He taught me so much about the intersection of politics and religion and how to do it right. And as I view some things that have happened through the years and how other people do it, I shake my head a little bit, because there's a right way to do it. And there's a way, in my view, that isn't so right. And so,
how's Donald Trump doing with that?
Well,
check the time. How many minutes are we in?
I didn't want to disappoint.
you couldn't resist that, could you?
Let me just, I did a podcast with Dwight Chapin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember that name.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Nixon's
White House
executive assistant.
Yeah.
And we talked a lot about, I don't know if it was mostly on or off the recording, but I was asking him several questions about Colson, because he is one of the most compelling figures to come out of that time period.
Yeah, he is. He wrote a book, Born Again, which had an enormous influence on me. It sold 2 million copies. Probably by now it's sold many more than that, but I remember going back shortly after he wrote the book. Colson was a tough guy. He was Nixon's hatchet man.
Nut cutter. That was the term Nixon loved. I need more nut cutters. None of these Ivy League, so on and so forth.
He didn't like the Ivy League, of course. He came from nothing. He came from a very modest background.
And Colson ran
California.
The plumbers.
Colson was a graduate of Brown University. Colson worked for Leverett Saltonstall. He was the youngest AA to a United States senator. Saltonstall in those days was in the Senate from Massachusetts as a Republican, no less. There haven't been many of those since then. And so Colson was a Marine, was an officer in the Marine Corps at a very young age. Colson was a Marine till the day he died. Everything about what he stood for and his enormous pride for the country and patriotism. He used to talk about being a Marine. And the older he got, the more he would reflect back on the principles of being a Marine.
Well, as I've often said on this podcast, my mother and my father were both in the Marine Corps.
And as was my father.
So. He was more than anything else, he was a Marine, and he would talk about leadership principles. And I drove him a lot.
Right.
Again, I'd pick him up at the airport when he'd come in here to speak and so forth. Spent a lot of time with him. He told me stories about Nixon, some of which he told me not to be repeated, and some of them I put in the book because I was fascinated with Nixon, too, his enormous ability to deal with American foreign policy. I thought was unequaled and unparalleled. And I've never seen a president that could tackle that like he could from that day to the present. But Colson had this ability to forgive and forget. He was drugged through a very difficult period of life, and he used to say, "I thank God for putting me in prison, because if I hadn't had that experience, my life would not have changed, and I wouldn't have found my ultimate purpose in life, which was to work with prisoners," which he did the rest of his life. He dedicated to the prisoners.
Jim, I want to turn it back over to you, but I'd like for you to ask about, because I was a sophomore at Howe High School, but you were covering it. The Secretary of State Simcox at the time was dead in the middle of it. It's one of my favorite Hoosier political stories, events, and that is the Bloody Eighth in 1984.
84.
Tell us what it was.
In the 8th District congressional race, Republican Rick McIntyre against Democrat Frank McCloskey.
Yes.
And it was before the recount commission, as you mentioned. You were in charge of it. Was actually the impetus for the creation of the recount commission.
That's right. I helped fashion the law after all of that passed the legislature in 86 to create the recount.
It was a race that, if I recall correctly, it was decided by 8 votes.
Well, it was decided by 4 votes out of 233,000 casts.
Right. And ultimately, it came to a vote on the floor of Congress, and it was Congress who decided the race.
That's right.
And Democrats controlled Congress at the time, and so Frank McCloskey won. But Newt Gingrich was not the Republican leader, but he did lead a Republican revolt in response to the Democrat vote in favor of Frank McCloskey, and he led a walkout of the Capitol, and I was there covering it.
Oh, I didn't know that you were there for that.
I was. That was my first trip to Washington.
The 8th District congressional race was the most consequential thing that ever happened in my life, because I was in the center of it. It really is the reason I wrote the book to start with. I devote 2 chapters to it in the book. Everything, the capsule that you just gave, the summary you just gave, Jim, is what those 2 chapters relate to. The Democrats had a 70-vote majority at that time in the Congress, in the lower house and the House of Representatives. They didn't need this seat, but they paid an enormous price. Tip O'Neill was Speaker, Jim Wright was Majority Leader. When I certified McIntyre, because he won on election night by 32 votes. He won in the recounts. Every county had its own recount in those days.
And a different system for recounting.
A different system for the recounts. Every count is a county-by-county recount. He won that by...
How many counties were involved?
There were parts of 13 counties in the district. Evansville was the largest municipal urban area. It was largely a rural congressional district aside from Evansville.
Well, and it touched on Bloomington because that's where McCloskey lived, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Frank was a mayor of Bloomington. I knew him a little bit. I took the bar exam with him. I didn't know him well, and I didn't know McIntyre well. McIntyre served in the Indiana House before he ran. I would see him at various functions, but I really didn't know him. But I was in the center of it because I certified him, and when I did that, all hell broke loose, so to speak, because the Democrats were not going to abide it, and they sent a 3-person task force to Indiana to do their own investigation. Leon Panetta, no less, who went on to be chief of staff for the President of the United States.
And a podcast guest of mine.
Okay, and a director
Fabulous.
of CIA and all this.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous man.
William Clay, who was the head of the Black Caucus at that time in Congress from St. Louis. He passed away just last year. And Bill, his last name is from California. He ultimately went on to be chair of the Ways and Means Committee, was a Republican. So the 3-person task force came to town, and they essentially did their own investigation of the recount process, of what I had done, the recount process.
Bill Thomas.
Thank you. William Thomas. And they met on April 18th of 1985. Mind you, this was 5.5 months after the actual election. This thing drug on for 5.5 months. I was in the center of the storm every day of the week during those 5.5 months. I was drugged through the mud on the microphone on the floor of the House out there by Democrats who were alleging that I did this wrong, I did that wrong, I intentionally stole these votes. My whole job, and I was the subject of editorials in the New York Times twice, the Washington Post, and all over the country. My whole job was to simply gather the votes, certify the winner, and report it, and so that the winner could be declared. So it was more of a ministerial job, actually, than anything else. I didn't have ruling authority over this. The Democrats made a mistake, in my view, as I look back. I mean, they had a 70-vote majority. Think of this, too, now. For the 30 years before 84, they'd held majority in the Congress. And they held all but 2 years in the preceding 20 years. So literally, they had held the majority in Congress for 50 years. It was an arrogance, in my view, on their part to do what they did when they brought the task force in here. And on a 2-1 vote on April 15, they declared Frank McCluskey the winner by 4 votes. They decided to reject 32 ballots in absentee ballots in Vanderburgh County when they did that. Shumway, I have a name of Bill Shumway, who was the Arizona Democratic leader of elections in the state of Arizona, they brought in as their main administrative guy to decide this thing. Shumway said later, if it had been up to me, I would have counted those ballots. The Evansville Courier went out and found the people who cast the 32 ballots. 20 of the 32 that they could get a hold of. They could only get a hold of 20 of them. And when they did their informal interviews of each of those 20, they asked them how they would vote. Enough of them said they voted for McIntyre to put McIntyre over the top, had those votes been counted. So, in the book, I say this as a summary. McIntyre won on Election Day by 18 votes, 32 votes. He won in the recounts by 418 votes. And if those votes in Vanderburgh County would have been counted, he would have won on the basis of what the task force did. But they were determined to take the election to Frank, in my view. That's what happened.
But more than winning the election, they created Newt Gingrich.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly you. You didn't read this, but that's in there.
That's right.
I feel like I'm responsible for Gingrich being Speaker of the House. In 10 years later, in 1994,
right,
was the Gingrich Revolution. Here's the interesting thing, Bob, about that election in 94 in Congress. When the Republicans took control of Congress in 94, this may be the only time this has happened, I don't know, but there was not one out of the 435 congressional districts in the United States of America, there wasn't one Republican who was defeated. Not one. Not one. I always remembered that as an amazing statistic. And so Gingrich takes control. But the walkout is a moment in the sun. He was the fighter. He got him going. And the old guard in the House, were used to compromising. They didn't go for this, and they reluctantly walked out. It was Gingrich who really led it. And so Politico did an article in 2023, and they called me and interviewed me and wanted to know my side of it. And based on my knowledge of political history, I thought, they're not going to give me a really good shake in this article.
Mm-hmm.
They did. It was very fair article. It was very analytical. This guy had interviewed 40 people who wrote the article, got a reporter by the name of Cruz. And it was an amazing article. But in the article, he says that this was the turning point in American politics, the 84 election. And I later heard a guy by the name of Dan Balz, B-A-L-Z,
Washington Post
reporter,
right,
on public radio, quite by chance, last year in 2025. I'm watching this thing, and I almost came out of my chair. They asked him, he was talking about all the people he'd known in politics when he covered the Hill. And then they said to him, is there a kind of a single event in American politics that you think stands out among the others as a moment in history? He says, yes, there is. And it was the 8th Congressional District race in the state of Indiana in 1984. I came out of my chair. and because Balz,
because you knew that, but also you're too close to it to get a perspective on it. Sure.
I had the manuscript ready to go to the printer, and I said, I want that back. And I put a couple of paragraphs in about this specific interview because it proved my point. But Balz said, he said it was at that moment where compromise turned to conflict. And the polarization that we see today in the American political system, which is very extreme, as we know, he feels got its start there.
So
he's not the only one that feels that way.
Donald Trump.
He's not the only one. You can't blame Donald Trump. He's not the only one that feels that, by the way. That is, I think
it led directly to Bork.
If you Google the provision in Congress that gives Congress the right to seat its own members, which is what created the task force and brought them in here. Actually, It was a congressional mandate that they had to do this. If you Google it, you will see 2 scholars had written a piece in there about the 8th Congressional District and talk about this race. So it's ingrained in the history of the country. I was in Helsinki, Finland, in a hotel room when this was going on. When the walkout, it was the day after the walkout, I was over there.
Okay.
And I'm checking out, and I'm looking at a big television screen in the lobby. All the Finns are around, and they're probably from people from other parts of the world. I didn't know. On the screen is a picture of me. And in Finnish language, which of course I can't understand and couldn't read, it was about the 8th district race. And then it showed, and then they go to a picture of all these guys walking down the steps of the Capitol, the whole Republican delegation in the Congress walking down the steps and walking out in protest of not seating McIntyre. And I looked around, and I didn't know whether to tap the guy on his shoulder ahead of me in line saying, that's me, or to pull my hood up.
Right.
I didn't do either one.
Jim, you were I would think it's fair to call you a young reporter, new in the state, and now you got to cover this.
In 84, I would have been 30 years old. Yeah.
What are some of your memories of that? Because every other race, even though the Orr race was close, because we've had Mark Lubbers and other people talk about, and Grand, talk about how close the 84 reelect was for.
But it was never in doubt. It was never in doubt. There was never a recount. That was a very tough story to cover because it was taking place in 13 counties, all of them in southwestern Indiana.
Right.
For television, it was, and it was all just people counting votes. And
there were 5. I was a defendant in 5 federal and 4 state court lawsuits.
Yeah.
On what I did, and I prevailed in each one of them. Gene Brooks was the judge in the federal district down in Jasper, and he held court at Jasper that day when I was down there. And as a defendant, he took the evidence. They suggested that I should have certified McCluskey and should not have certified McIntyre, which I had done. And they presented all the evidence. I was represented by a deputy attorney general. And he said, well, let me take this evidence. I'm going to retire to my chambers, and I'll come back and give you a decision. So he was gone for, 30 minutes or an hour. He comes back, and he rules in my favor. And Gene Brooks was a Democrat-appointed judge.
Yeah.
And I thought, when he left to do this, I thought, okay, we're going to see what happens here. He saw it as he called the shots as he saw them. And so when I look back on the experience, I know I did the right thing. And there's a point at which, there's a sense in which it would have been easier to certify Frank McCluskey and stay out of all the heat of the moment. I didn't play politics, which people thought I did. I know they did, and I'll never persuade anybody otherwise, I guess. I wasn't doing this to see that a Republican could be elected to Congress. It wouldn't have made any difference out there anyway. It was 70 votes, majority of the Democratic Party. But at a certain point, I looked in the mirror and said, hey, I got to call this shot the way I see it. And if I don't, if I play games with it in any way for either side, I'm in trouble here, and I'm not doing my job. So
what did you think in 2000, watching what was going on in Florida?
It was amazing to me. In 2000, 1984 came back to me. It was like looking in a mirror, because Kathleen Harris, you may remember that name. She was the Secretary of State
of Florida. Yeah.
So she was in the center of the controversy. And then in 2020, Raffensperger in Georgia was the Secretary of State. The heat was all on him. The Trump literally, personally, and all of his people were firing away at this Republican Secretary of State in Georgia. And I thought about these people, and I thought, I relate very much to this and what they're going through. It all happened to me back in 84.
Yep. Well, just to finish up, there was a rematch in the 8th in 86.
Yes.
Without a recount. McCluskey won.
Won handily.
It was a bad year for Republicans nationwide.
It was a bad year nationwide.
Except for Dave Quayle.
Ronald Reagan, the president, it was the only visit that he made to personally campaign in a congressional district in 86, and it was for McIntyre. It was a rerun of 84, both the same candidates, but Frank won it, I think, by 13, 14 points.
Yeah, and then McIntyre became a judge.
Became a circuit judge in Lawrence County, yes.
And then sadly took his own life.
His own life. Both Frank McCluskey and Rick McIntyre are gone. They can't give their version of the story anymore. But
which was, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm probably not phrasing it very well, but actually this is for both of you too. Which was more foreseeable? The rise of Evan Bayh, or we'll call it the rise of Mitch Daniels? When Evan Bayh got on the scene, were you like, we got a bit of a problem here? And when Mitch Daniels decided to run for governor, were you finally like, we got somebody who can win?
Yeah. That's an interesting question, because I would say there's some similarities. Remember, Evan Bayh came on the scene, ran for Secretary of State after 20 years of Republican governorship. His overall message is it's time for a change. People kind of thought, yeah, in a lot of ways it is. And so that's kind of was the start of his career. He kicked it off with that kind of a message. Mitch came on the scene after 16 years of Democratic governorship. Evan Bayh 8 years. Frank succeeded him, and so you had this time for a change kind of a message. There were some parallels there, I think, and I think
Mitch tried to disguise it. His line was, after 16 years, every garden needs weeding.
That's right. And he was a Marion County guy, and historically in Republican Party, Marion County candidates didn't fare very well statewide. Right. Hudnut didn't, of course, as you know, and
Goldsmith,
and you go back and Goldsmith. So what Mitch did was brilliant. Of course, he got the motorhome and you couldn't tag him with the guy sitting in Indianapolis running his campaign. He went into every little, including my home community of Rolling Prairie, Indiana, a few miles from the Michigan state line, 500 people, because I had chided him into doing it. I said, you haven't been around, Mitch, if you don't go to Rolling Prairie. He did, went to Rolling Prairie and had a campaign stop there. But it was a brilliant campaign on his part in that regard, of course. And Evan, was mature, politically mature beyond his years. He was 32 years old when he ran for governor. And people thought, well, he's going to be buried in controversy. He doesn't know how to handle all this. Well, he did. He did. He did his thing.
Did you think about running for governor in 88? What you were alluding to at the beginning of the podcast?
I've thought about running for governor several times, but you have to have, as you know, the stars have to line up for you, and you got to have some things that work and come together. And it didn't work for me.
Did anyone run against Mutz? And I want you to answer the by Daniels question that I posed to Mr. Simcox. But I mean, did you see that coming?
Did I see what coming?
Evan By and the dominance that for 16 years?
Well, I didn't see the 16 years coming, certainly. Right. I think in terms of at the start of each of their initial campaigns, I think Mitch Daniels, you'd have to say, was a much better bet.
Remember that Joe Kernan, when he took over from Frank, when Frank passed away, and there was like a year and change left in that term, he first said he wasn't going to run again.
He had started a campaign and he stopped it. He withdrew. He withdrew, and Joe Andrew and Vi Simpson had mounted campaigns. Yes. And then when he became lieutenant governor, then he announced that he was going to get back in, and those other two had to get out. And and it was a huge disadvantage.
It was an awkward situation. He really didn't gain much footing because he got in a lot later. Mitch had been doing this for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you one of the people who met with Mitch Daniels?
I was. How
did you, I guess I'll use the verb convince.
He was, at that time, he was working in the White House for W.
Budget director.
And I called him one day and I said, you got to come back here and run for governor. He said, well, and he said, you're one of the few people that is calling me that I want to take your viewpoints to heart, which I thought, okay, that was great. But what he said to me, he said, I would like for you to write a memo and put some things in it that you think I need to, if you were in my shoes and you were running for governor, how would you do it? What would you do? What would you focus on, and so forth? So that was a lot of fun. I did that. And he said, I'm going to give you an address to send it to, because at that time, white powder was showing up in the White House, anthrax. And there was a real scare. And so literally all the White House mail went to a warehouse someplace outside of Washington where it was screened before ever going to the White House. He says, it's going to take me forever to get it, number one, and number two, it won't get to me here. So he gave me another, I can't remember what it was, but he gave me another address to send it to. So I did. So I was kind of on board early, and I was on a little executive committee for him for his campaign.
One of the rooms you were in, I should reset this. We're discussing In the Room, a memoir with author Ed Simcox, joined by Jim Shella. One of the rooms you were in was the RIFRA room.
Yes.
And I know that because I was sitting about 5 feet from you.
Yes.
In the RIFRA room.
I remember that.
Now, Mike Pence means the world to you, and I know you mean the world to him. And I think the absolute world of Mike Pence. He's always been ridiculously kind. Gave me the last Sagamore before he left to go take the oath, which he didn't have to do, which is typical of...
He dropped one off the TV station for me.
Fly by in the plane? Or
I don't know. They had at my going away party, it was everybody left and it was over in the corner.
Yeah.
I took it home like it was the last piece of cake.
I was going to say, I'll look for it the next time I'm in the studio.
He, in fairness to the governor, he had been elected vice president 4 days earlier. So
Yeah.
Of all the political controversies you've seen in your career, was RFRA the most avoidable?
He made some bad moves. He stubbed his toe. He admitted it later publicly in a way, he admitted it to me personally. There are things that he should have done that he didn't do and things that he should not have done that he did. We all know that. It was a total shock to the system for him because he didn't see it coming. If you're going to do battle politically, you make certain moves, you know what's going to happen and so forth. Well, this thing, RFRA exploded in his face, and all of a sudden he was handed the hot poker. What do you do with it? And so he held meetings in the governor's office. He invited me in there. He asked me to bring some people in for meetings, which I did on 2 occasions, and fairly large groups, to counsel with him, to hear him out, and to give him advice and so forth. I was in some other meetings. I was in a couple of meetings with gay advocates who came to talk to him. And interestingly, in those meetings, and this is what some people don't understand, and this is part of his personality, he was very deferential. He took notes. He wanted immediately to put them at ease. They were uncomfortable going in there. They thought we're going into a bear trap here. That was not the case. As you know, Pence and his personality, that's not the way he operates. He said, look, I genuinely want to meet with you. I want to hear you out and so forth. And so all these meetings were interesting. When the legislature passed what they called the fix to this, I was sitting in my office, which is right across the street. I was in the AUL building in those days with the window looking down on the Capitol building. I got a call. I was out of my office, actually, and I heard the phone ring. I ran in there. It was Mike Pence, and he said, I have this amendment sitting on my desk, and I'm unsure as to whether I'm going to sign this or not. And he said, I'd like to get your sense of it. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that he called that morning. He was in a quandary on this. And if you remember, Karen and the girls were gone. They were in Europe or something. He was at the residence alone. He didn't have Karen, who was always his backstop, his trade-off in terms of what am I going to do today and so forth. And so I said, Governor, this is an easy one for me to answer. I don't have to take a lot of your time. You get up every day wanting to do the best thing for the state of Indiana. Your whole legacy as governor rides on this. You're in a jam and a fix. You got to get out of it. You got to get on with the business of the state. You can't let this drag everybody down, and you included. You've got to sign this.
Don't get lost in the details. I think that's great advice, I think.
So he said, the only thing he said to me, he paused a minute. There was nothing on the other end of the phone. I'm thinking, well, he's going to argue with me on this, but he didn't. He said, you know what? This was about 10 o'clock in the morning. He said, when I left the residence today, you're confirming what I thought I needed to do. I said, well, you got to do it, Governor. You don't have any choice. You got to do this. So that was my input.
Well, because at that point, he not only had national media coming down on him and the gay community.
The threats of boycotts from sports figures.
Well, yeah, and because of the threats of boycotts,
yeah.
he had the corporate community coming down on him.
That was the biggest surprise, Jim. When Lilly, Cummins, the magnates of industry here in this state, when they all came down on him on it, it was the thing it was the last straw, so to speak, that broke the camel's back, and it was the biggest thing.
And of all the things he didn't see coming, that's what he didn't see.
That's what he didn't see coming right there.
We have just a few minutes left with Ed Simcox, author of In the Room and Memoir. Ed and I were sitting next to each other in the room the day before the Stephanopoulos interview.
I never got invited in the room.
You didn't?
You were in the room.
Wait a second.
I
You
will
called
tell
me.
you-
Called me right after the Stephanopoulos interview, not to offer condolences, to say, Vane, I got to talk to you tomorrow about this interview.
I was in that room that day. I was interviewed live on MSNBC in the same chair that Mike Pence sat in for the Stephanopoulos interview an hour earlier, and nobody remembered my interview.
We got about 15. We got just 15 minutes or so, a little bit less. Jim, do you want to ask Mr. Simcox, before we get to the 5 questions, do you want to ask him about the fact that the big, everyone paying attention to race in 2026 is Indiana Secretary of State?
Well, sure. I mean, I'd like to ask him about that. I would also like, because what we haven't touched on is he spent much of his career representing electric utilities in this state, and I'd like to ask him about what's going on with utility regulation at the moment too. But we probably don't have time for that.
Go ahead.
How's the governor handling utility regulation at the moment?
He is injecting himself in very deep in all of this, and he's sending signals in the media through the media to his regulators, to his people in his administration as to what he wants to do here. The companies are, it's a dilemma for them because of the extraordinary capital that it takes to run these companies. And of course, I'm biased here because I worked for them for many years.
Well, in full disclosure, my father owned a small utility when I was growing up, an electric utility.
Okay. And so
I have some perspective on this too.
You know the game.
He had to sell his company because of the cost of regulation. He couldn't get a rate increase that would match the expense.
It's the electric utility industry is the most capital-intensive industry in the world. There's nothing that's more capital-intensive because of the billions of dollars that it takes to do the infrastructure. The other thing to be said about it is that they have the time horizons under which they factor what they're doing in the future are so long. It takes 10 years to build a plant. So you have to look out literally beyond 10 years and say, we will need this by a certain date in order to be reliable and be able to deliver the energy that we're required to do under the law. And so they have their issues and they have their problems. And of course, I worked for the board of directors. Again, in the book, I say a little bit about that. I learned a lot about leadership by working for the heads of these companies. When I started doing this when I ran the trade association for the electrics, all but one of the companies was totally owned here in Indiana. And so I was working literally for the CEOs of the companies. And I learned a lot about leadership from these guys. They were very decisive. They were impatient to make decisions because they had to make big decisions every day. And the other thing interesting about them, and I learned this too from being in a seminar of a guy I thought very highly of, who worked with Walt Disney in forming Disney World. I went to 2 or 3 of his seminars. His name was Mike Vance, and he worked with Jack Welch at GE also, 2 of the really great leaders of the country. And he used to say, there's one thing about leaders, they never look back. They are never bound by the past. Not that they don't look back and take lessons from what they learned in the past, but they're always forward-thinking, always forward-looking.
Windshield's big, the rearview mirror's small.
That's one of the great things I learned from working for the people who ran the companies.
So, to the Secretary of State's race, Greg Ballard, former mayor of Indianapolis, is trying to create a new political party, running the Lincoln Party, I believe it's called, right? It's basically an alternative Republican Party, if I understand correctly.
It's an independent party.
As like I said. So all of a sudden you've got 4 candidates. You got a Libertarian, you got a Lincoln Party candidate, you got a Democrat, you got a Republican. Is this healthy?
Well, in one sense, it's healthy. And of course, having spent my entire life in Republican politics, it is also
healthy for democracy, not healthy for the GOP.
Exactly. It's also concerning because I don't, in all likelihood, the mayor will pull votes. He could likely pull votes from both the Democrat and Republican candidates, but because, of course, he has been so identified with the Republican Party, and particularly in the largest county in the state, there's a likelihood, there's a sense in which I think he will pull a lot of votes that might otherwise have gone to a Republican candidate. So that's concerning, yeah. But it's... Are
the thresholds, I mean, he had to submit 37,000 signatures in order to get on the ballot, and he managed to do that. It cost him a lot of money, but he did it. And now one of his goals, if not to be elected, is to win 10% of the vote so that his party has ballot access in 2 years. Are those thresholds high enough, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I haven't thought that much about that. Usually those thresholds are so high that they're not met.
Well, that's why they were created, so that they wouldn't be met. And now he's proving that they can be met.
Yeah, he very possibly can meet those thresholds with his candidacy. Yeah. We'll see how it all goes. But this is a little bit of, we're all political history buffs here, the three of us, and presumably an awful lot of the people who listen to you regularly, Robert, in this podcast are as well. And so everybody is watching this race very closely for that. That's one of the reasons. And to see how this vote splits four ways. And of course, add to that, I was at the convention, Republican State Convention in Fort Wayne a few weeks ago, and witnessed the fact that the ultimate candidate received around 800 votes from delegates. The second candidate of the three candidates on the second ballot received 600, and the incumbent Secretary of State received 130. And so,
it's pretty clear there was some unhappiness.
It was a decisive run for a candidate who got in on the very day of deadline for filing.
I have so many disclaimers to say. I'm not sure what I could add. I will say, and we're going to let Jim ask you the 5 questions, if you don't mind, Jim.
Sure.
I will say this because I want to get along with everybody, and we work hard to do that on the podcast. Your friend Michael Leppert was just sitting here where I'm sitting.
Haven't seen him for a long time.
Diego Morales is not the Republican candidate for Secretary of State because of Greg Ballard.
You're saying that he would have won the convention if there hadn't been a threat on the outside.
I'm saying that the viability in the biography and the performance of Greg Ballard as mayor made enough people nervous, along with Diego's conduct, that they had to make a change. I do not believe they would have made that change if Greg Ballard had not launched his effort. No. With the disclaimer being that Greg Ballard is my ultimate amazing hero, and I worked for him and still work for him and think he will be a great Secretary of State. That's not our job here on the podcast, but when my guy's name is mentioned...
Nice use of the platform.
Yeah. When my guy's name gets mentioned, that's a different story.
But what you're saying is much like the Bloody Eighth created Newt Gingrich, we have unintended consequences here, which are Diego Morales has been set aside, but this could lead to significant changes in the way Indiana politics operates going forward.
And it should not have been up to Greg Ballard's candidacy to have a new Secretary of State nominee from the Republican Party.
Yeah.
An alternative Republican Party?
Independent, but yeah.
All right. The 5 questions, Ed. We know that your first political job was a driver for Ed Whitcomb. What was your first job?
My first job was working for my dad in a variety of businesses that he ran, principally a Christmas tree growing and harvesting and selling business. And he was a pretty tough taskmaster, but that was my first job.
And it sounds seasonal, but it's not, right?
Exactly. It is not. It's all year round.
What was your first concert?
Oh, gosh. My first concert would have been, I used to have a band, and we played a lot of little restaurants and bars and VFW halls and American Legions and so forth. And so I, pretty familiar with music. I don't remember my first concert. I do remember seeing Elvis Presley twice. The second time was his last concert.
At Market Square Arena?
Yeah. Yeah. Which was my most memorable concert, perhaps.
Okay. You're here promoting a book, obviously, but that aside, if you could suggest a book for someone to read, one book, what would you suggest?
I would say, of course, which you might expect, I would say the Bible. In terms of I read tons of books on political history and American history. And I know you are a great student of American history. I learned that from listening to your podcast,
Thank
Robert.
you, sir.
And so I'm very impressed with your knowledge and background on these things. But one of the books I read a long time ago, which is remarkable, was it was about Douglas MacArthur, and it was Manchester's book, American Caesar. And I so much so that when I was in Japan, I wanted to go see the office that he occupied when he literally was the ruler of Japan. And there's a whole story behind that, which we don't have time to get into. But anyway, the American Caesar was one of those books that really riveted me.
Question number 4. If you could witness any event in history, be there live, what would you like to witness?
There are several things that I saw when I traveled to Israel in terms of biblical history that I would like to witness. And I would like to see the Apostle Paul talking to the Athenians at the Acropolis. I've thought a lot about that, and I traveled there because I wanted to see that and see where he stood on Mars Hill.
Lovely.
It's not on YouTube.
No.
If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose?
Wow. I suppose that I would choose, for complicated reasons, Donald Trump, who is historically one of the most interesting characters in American political history. Came back from the ashes and wins a re-election, after everything that he went through and so forth. So, yeah, that would be, I guess right now, today, that'd be my choice.
He would fill the 2 hours, let me say.
He would fill the 2. I wouldn't have to worry about filling it with my own voice.
Jim, would you sit down with him if he called you?
Well, I was just going to say, I've interviewed a number of presidential candidates and former presidents. I don't often get invited to interview the president. But normally with a presidential candidate, they'll give you 3 minutes, or if you're lucky, 5 minutes. Trump gave me 15. His approach to things is, in many ways, is very different from anyone who came before him. And he likes to talk and he likes to share.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business, registered with the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest, Ed Simcox, former Secretary of State, author of In the Room, a memoir. Thank you, Jim, for co-hosting, as always.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed.
I will say very quickly that I've been in the room with Mr. Simcox a few times, and I remember one particular time at the governor's residence during RFRA where you came up to me afterwards when it was, I'll say there were 12 people and I had a different view than 11 of them. And you came to me and you said, "I'm really glad to see you here, Robert. We need your perspective." I've never forgotten that.
Thank you.
And I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm grateful to you for all that you've done, all that you do, both of you. I've got great fond memories of Jim Shella being a part of the State House Press Corps. The reason I do is because he always respected people who held office. You could sense it as an office holder. Not everybody in the media did. In fact, many did not. Jim did. And Jim, I thank you. And Robert, I thank you for what you're doing today.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.